In this segment of the larger lecture on labor and the underclass, we really get into the emergence of organized labor in the United States. In 1877, with the railroad strike, and for that matter with the Knights of Labor, you begin to see the elements of organization. But for instance, at Haymarket, most of the action is carried out by anarchists who are not necessarily affiliated with any specific organization. And much of what happens even in 1877 tends to be kind of a leaderless violence, a product of shared ideas and expectations. But by the early 1890s, we get examples that are far more clearly the result of labor organization and the emergence of unions with very practical and specific goals in mind. So I want to introduce then the organization, specifically the union, that follows up Haymarket and in many ways displaces the Knights of Labor in representing the American worker. And that, of course, is the American Federation of Labor, or you'll also hear me refer to it as the AF-L. After 1886, after the riots had occurred at Haymarket Square, Terence Powderly denounced what had happened in 86. He denounced the strikes, but the Knights had gone, events had gone beyond the Knights of Labor. The Knights had been painted with the brush of radicalism. There were revolutionaries, and in some ways, again, their ideas were pretty idealistic, if not utopian. But the point of it all is that after the Haymarket riots, the Knights of Labor, numerically, their numbers begin to decline. And whether it's true or not, there's a very clear pattern there that the association, the taint of radicalism that was connected with Haymarket became connected with the Knights of Labor, and their numbers suffered. The American Federation of Labor, which would emerge sort of to take the place of the Knights of Labor, and the Knights don't entirely ever go away, but the American Federation of Labor was founded in 1881, so it was in existence before the Haymarket Square riots occurred and the bombings. And initially it consisted of about 140,000 members. But what makes it different from the Knights of Labor and allows it perhaps to avoid some of the taint of radicalism is that it's focused on the craft unions. Now, what that means is this, okay? The Knights of Labor had tried to represent or create an organization which had included all labor, men, women, African Americans, whites, but also with skilled and unskilled workers. The problem, of course, is that since it's time unskilled workers sell, they can be replaced by anyone else willing to sell time. Skilled workers, on the other hand, are more difficult to replace because there's an element that they own, that they control, which is intimately caught up with the success of production. Without that skill that the worker possesses, you can't produce the good you want to produce. Well, the simple result is the skilled worker has leverage. The American Federation of Labor, by focusing on the craft unions, is focusing on skilled labor. And that is an idea about leverage, that the AFL will be able, by focusing on skilled workers, to have leverage in negotiations with employers. But the other side of this is that by focusing on the craft unions and skilled labor, the AFL will be able to push out of their union or keep out of their union the unskilled labor that's often connected with ethnicity, race, and radicalism, so that the taint of radicalism won't infect the AFL to the same extent it had affected the Knights of Labor. The leader of the AFL is Samuel Gompers, and a lot of this emerges from Gompers' ideas about labor and about the practicality of the situation labor is in this new American economy. Gompers is an immigrant who's come from London. He was born in 1850. And you think there, you're kind of thinking about Dickens, Charles Dickens and all that kind of idea of London. But he had become the head, before becoming the leader of the AFL, he had become the head of the Cigar Makers Union. He was a roller of cigars, in other words. He was connected with a craft. He understood skilled labor and the value that those skills still had, even in this changing economic and industrial climate. So the AFL will reject this notion of the brotherhood of all workers. Not everybody, but focusing on the skilled worker, the crafts. That excludes many women who aren't going through the process of apprentice, journeyman, master to become a master of the craft. It also excludes many immigrants who are coming to this country and often lack the skills or don't have the connections to get into existing craft networks. Their goals, the goals of the AFL, are very practical. They're not utopian. They felt that labor should work within existing economic system or within the existing economic system rather than trying to create an entirely new system. The Knights of Labor had called for changes that would have, in essence, undermined the system as it existed. Instead of calling for things like an 8-hour day or the rights of women or equal pay for equal work, for calling for an end to national banks, anything of that nature, the AFL is going to shoot for far more practical goals that they believe can be achieved and gradually will lead to improvement of conditions for America's working people. The key and the really most important of these practical goals would be the recognition of unions to represent workers in negotiation. In other words, a recognition by employers of the right of unions, labor unions, to bargain collectively on behalf of workers. You see, if you could get that, if you could get unions recognized as an agent for workers, then unions have, in essence, been recognized as part of the existing economic system. Really, it's a fundamental kind of change we're talking about by getting unions and the idea that you negotiate with unions integrated into the economic system that exists. In terms of other practical goals, let me suggest that rather than going after an 8-hour day, the AFL was perfectly happy going after a shorter day. Similarly, in terms of higher wages, it wasn't X amount or a certain amount or equal wages or anything else. It was just efforts to achieve higher wages, to see improvement in the returns coming back to workers in the new economic system. After 1886, after what had happened at Haymarket Square, the AFL is basically reorganized, and its goals, though, are reaffirmed. In other words, nothing new's coming out of here. The AFL is just emphasizing more firmly its basic practicality. By 1902, it will have more than 1 million members. By 1917, the year that the United States enters the First World War, the AFL and its affiliated unions will claim 2.5 million members. Well, moving forward here, I need to tell you a bit about the Homestead steel strike. In 1892, in the summer of 1892, workers at a steel manufacturing facility in Homestead, Pennsylvania, owned by Andrew Carnegie, had gone on strike. And they had been locked out. That is to say that once they went on strike, they had been locked out of the plant, and what they'd then done was to actually surround the plant. It was a common tactic to be used, or that was used by owners of facilities like factories and plants, basically ensuring that the workers had no access, and then seeking, once they had sort of denied workers access, seeking ways to bring in strike breakers so that production could go forward and continue at the plant. That's effectively what was happening at Homestead. Day-to-day management of the Homestead steel plant had fallen or been given over by Andrew Carnegie to a fellow named Henry Clay Frick, Henry C. Frick. He was known for his ferocity. He was known to be a very harsh man to deal with. He didn't take much guff. And on the other side of the equation, opposite Frick, of course, is the union. Among others represented at Homestead was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. The major issues at Homestead in 1892 for the strike were wage cuts and working conditions. In essence, in this new economy and under Frick, and really Carnegie too, Carnegie I think knew what was going on at Homestead, workers felt that they were being pushed beyond their capacity, that the working conditions were simply too heinous, too dangerous to continue without walking off and saying enough's enough. And they weren't willing to simply surrender their jobs. They needed those jobs, but they were willing to say, we will go on strike unless we're paid for the work we do and unless there are changes made to the way we're asked to work. For Frick, and for many owners of plants or managers of plants, the question had always been a question of efficiency. How do you get the most out of workers? Less concern was paid in the late 19th century to how workers were to be treated. It wasn't their call how work was run. It was the call of the owners, the call of those who controlled the property. You worked for them. That was sort of the mentality. Well, as I mentioned, there's a lockout at Homestead. And what makes this strike so fascinating and worth consideration is that for the first time, unlike the previous episodes we've talked about involving labor unrest, we see here the active part that's played by a union, by a labor organization with structure. During the railroad strike back in 1877, you're talking about sort of a shared vision, a shared sense of grief and pain that leads people to sort of naturally, without the aid of an organization, to express that and take it out on the railroads and sort of attack that vague and ambiguous thing which they see happening but they can't quite put their finger on. At Haymarket, with the relationship of the Knights will fare very poorly because of Haymarket, but understand that they're not specifically involved. More so, they're involved with the McCormick plant. And there, too, it's not as if you have what we would consider a true labor union at work. It's more that sense of shared grievance leading to kind of cooperative effort, but it's not a directed thing. By the time you get to Homestead in 1892, the efforts of the strikers are being directed, and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers is largely responsible for that direction. And they have, by the summer of 1892, they have the steel plant virtually surrounded. And inside the plant are a small number of guards who are denying the workers entry. Frick develops a plan, and I'll try to be brief here. Frick develops a plan to send approximately 300 Pinkerton agents. These are part of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and they're often the people called in, really, they're called in when you need to use force. They can be deputized, but they serve as sort of mercenaries oftentimes when you have a labor situation develop. You bring in the Pinkertons. It's a long way from their Civil War origins. But at any rate, Frick develops a plan to send some 300 Pinkertons by river into the plant. Remember, the plant is cut off by strikers who have surrounded it by land, and only river access seems to allow an opening, an avenue for access. Strikers hear about the plans, and they actually send out groups of strikers to meet the Pinkertons along the river. And when the Pinkertons try to cross, they're fired upon. Some will ultimately make it into the plant. But the resistance that occurs will lead a number of strikers and Pinkerton detectives dead, many more casualties. The failed effort to put, many more Pinkertons into the plant will ultimately lead the Pinkertons to surrender. They agree to surrender their position inside the plant. But guess who's going to step in here? You remember that I mentioned the precedent, the role that government would have in this early kind of labor unrest. And as you saw with the 1877 strike, what you saw with the enforcement that goes on after Haymarket and the Haymarket Square unrest, here again the state steps in, but on behalf of the owner. Pennsylvania will call in the state militia, sort of the National Guard of its day, and they will take up positions inside the factory and on high ground, just beyond the factory. It takes them a matter of hours to drive strikers away and end the lockout. And that's an amazing thing, how quickly that's done, and how quickly Frick and other company managers can return to the plant, and then how quickly strikebreakers or workers hired to replace those on strike can resume operations. As the original Homestead workers saw what was happening, that the strike-breaking workers were attempting to relight the furnaces to get production going again, there were instances where they tried to intervene, but they were stopped summarily by the state militia of Pennsylvania. The strike had failed miserably at Homestead, and it had failed in no small part because of the choices that government had made when it came to American labor.